My name's Deputy Inspector General of Police, Dr. Shehu, PSC. To talk about PRAWA, Prisoners Rehabilitation and Welfare Action, we have a very, very good rapport, good understanding, and good synergy between the police and PRAWA for many years. It is an institution that concerns primarily on respect of dignity and human rights, which the police are supposed to be part of it. And also capacity building to the police to enable them to perform effectively and efficiently in conjunction with the fundamental respect to the fundamental human rights as enshrined into the Nigerian constitutions of 1999. It's very, very beneficial, and at the same time in building capacity and enabling the police officers to perform credibly when they go out to discharge their duties. The police is an organization that deals with all kinds of human beings. When they come across a police officer, they deserve to be respected by police in ensuring not only their security and safety, but also in respecting their dignity and human rights. So in a nutshell, the training and retraining we are getting from the PRAWA is to enable us have police that will function and discharge their duties in a most standard and acceptable manner by members of the public. At this juncture, I want to say kudos. Welcome to the Nigeria Police Force online training.
We're now going to look at the lesson objectives. And the lesson objective is to create awareness on the need to control the use of force in discharging police duties. To also introduce the plan principles as the fundamental principles regulating the policy on the use of force and firearms, as well as emphasize the universality of the principles. What is the expected outcome? The expected outcome is that the trainees and the participants will be able to, at the end of the training, identify the regulations guiding the use of force and the need to comply with them. Okay, talking about the use of force, we are talking about the plan principles now. We need to know that the fundamental principles underpinning the policy on the use of force is that any action taken must comply with the fundamental principles of legality, necessity, proportionality, and accountability. And these principles must be applied in a non-discriminatory manner. So in carrying out their duties, members of the force shall, as far as practicable, and insofar as the circumstances dictate, consider non-physical means before resorting to the use of force. It's imperative that I let us know that these principles are vital components of any complete assessment of the use of force. They are also important in framing approaches to law enforcement, as they are meant to help the police as an organization, as well as helping individual police officers to comply with the law and follow the highest standards of practice. In addition, the principles are to ensure that all actions taken in the course of law enforcement are evidence-based, are proportionate, accountable, and transparent. This includes explaining why a particular course of action was taken. The use of force must only be resorted to with the utmost respect for the law and with the consideration for the serious impact it can have on a range of human rights: the right to life, to physical and mental integrity, to human dignity, to privacy, and to freedom of movement, to name just the ones most frequently affected. The general principles that must govern any use of force have been set out very clearly by the UN Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial executions, and they are as follows. Let us now consider the principle of proportionality. The principle of proportionality is about means and end. It states that in pursuing an end, you must use a means that is helpful, you must use a means that is necessary and appropriate. Consequently, a means that is not helpful to reach the end is not a real means. So proportionality in law enforcement is therefore doing what is necessary to achieve an authorized objective. And I need to let us know here that at every point in time for a Nigerian police officer, the authorized objective must never be different from the statutory duties as found in Section 4 of the Police Act. So this principle of proportionality is meant to give control discretion. We know that in law enforcement, you cannot do without deploying discretion. But what's important is that whenever a law enforcement officer is deploying discretion, it must be positively deployed. That is to ensure the achievement of that authorized objective. So consequently, in using force in the course of executing their statutory duties, the police and other statutorily authorized law enforcement officers are only entitled to use only means that are fit, means that are necessary, means that are appropriate. The means must be such that work, and it should be noted that there should be no other means that will be equally effective but less harmful. The end must be important enough to justify the means. Though the police may intrude into citizens' life, liberty, and property in order to fight dangers to public safety and order, the intrusion must not be arbitrary. The intrusion must be such that complies with these universal principles that had earlier been stated. So, proportionality therefore implies that force should only be used when it is unavoidable. The means must be such that work. There should be no other means that will be equally effective but less harmful. The principle of accountability, simply stated, is the acknowledgement and assumption of responsibility for actions and decisions taken by any police officers or any law enforcement officer. It includes the obligation to report, explain, and be answerable for resulting consequences. It also includes the award of punishments in the case of any eventual misconduct. Since the police is a creation of law, all activities and action of the force are regulated by law. Consequently, the law and some internal rules, such as the force order and force administrative instruction, are mechanisms to hold officers and men of the force accountable. In the same vein, police officers are subordinate in hierarchy and accountable to their superiors. There are also some independent watchdogs that scrutinize and hold the force and its personnel accountable. It therefore implies that though the personnel of the force may be individually held responsible for their actions, the force as a corporate entity can also be held accountable for the actions of its personnel. The principle of accountability demands prompt reporting through the appropriate chain of command in every instance when force is used, for example, or when a firearm has been discharged, or when death or injury has been caused. The superior police officers are to be held responsible for the actions of police under their command. If the SPO knew or should have known of abuses but failed to take concrete actions, that is talking about vicarious liability. So the principle of accountability permits no excuses for following unlawful order, but stipulates that immunity should be given to police officer who refuses unlawful orders. The third one is the principle of necessity. The principle of necessity entails that law enforcement officials in carrying out their duty shall, as far as possible, apply non-violent means before resorting to the use of force and firearms. They may use force and firearms only if other means remain ineffective or without any promise of achieving the intended objective. Forceful means are only to be introduced when they are strictly necessary for the maintenance of public order, so as to protect the life and property and prevent a serious deterioration of the situation. Restraint must, however, be exercised when it becomes strictly necessary to use force. Only the minimum level of force required must be used, and for the time necessary. The principle emphasizes the use of minimum action, including the use of armed force, sufficient to bring a situation under control to defend against hostile and hostile intent. All such actions must, however, cease as soon as the target complies with instructions or ceases hostile action. The principle also emphasizes that the use of firearms must be considered as a means of last resort. So minimum force can therefore be described as the amount of force that is necessary to achieve authorized objective. Since the principle of minimum force deals with actions to defend against hostile act and hostile intent, it is imperative to state in clear terms what constitutes hostile acts and intent. Hostile act is an attack where the intent is to cause death, bodily harm, or destruction of designated property, while hostile intent is the threat of imminent force, which is demonstrated through an action which appears preparatory to hostile act. The principle of minimum force is one of the most important underlying principles of all activities of the Nigeria police, as well as all other police services in other parts of the world. All activities of law enforcement undertaken by police must always be subject to the principle of minimum force, as it is the golden rule that must be considered in all circumstances. The test for deciding whether or not minimum force was used is subjective. That is, it is decided whether the force measured in terms of the reasonable man test was reasonable. The test is whether a reasonable man under the same circumstance would have applied the same amount of force. So what appears reasonable to the person that is using the force must also appear reasonable to another reasonable man in the same circumstance. So one very useful criterion that can be used when determining minimum force is to ask the question, isn't there another way to deal with the situation? If the authorized objective or intended aim cannot be achieved without using the force, then the force to be used will be minimum. In answering the question, isn't there any other way, it is pertinent to ensure that all the relevant factors and circumstances objectively present are taken into account. So the principle of minimum force must therefore be applied in full measure in every disturbance situation of internal security operation. This must be accomplished with minimum injury to persons or damage to property. Consequently, the use of force must be restricted to the minimum degree consistent with mission accomplishment. The use of excessive or unnecessary force may subject the responsible person to civil and criminal liability. Then, what is reasonable force? Each person under the law has the right to use force that may be reasonably necessary to defend oneself against violent and dangerous personal attack. Reasonable force is therefore the amount of force necessary to protect oneself or one's property. Reasonable force is a term associated with defending one's person or property from a violent attack, theft, or other type of unlawful aggression. It may be used as a defense in a criminal trial or to defend oneself in a suit alleging tortious conduct if one uses excessive force or more than the force necessary for such protection. He or she may be considered to have forfeited the right to defense. So reasonable force is also known as legal force. So in general, reasonable force can be defined as the minimum force required to deter or prevent an assault from occurring or being repeated. This will include removing yourself from a potentially violent situation before the assault occurs, verbal de-escalation, posturing, and physically defending oneself. It is, however, imperative that a reasonable assessment of the threat level be conducted in order to act accordingly. Consequently, if you can live safely without risking injury to yourself or another, then you must live. If however one is being assaulted or an assault is imminent, then only the amount of force necessary to stop the assault can be used. You are not permitted to punish the assailant or seek revenge. The question to ask oneself always is, what another reasonable person would have done in the same circumstances? Thank you.